6 months ago, my dad kicked me out so my golden child half-brother, Derek, could move in. Now, they're begging me to lie to cover up his crime, or they'll end up in jail. I just turned 18 4 months ago, and Derek's 24. He decided he was too good to rent his own place and wanted to crash with my dad instead, so I was the one forced to leave. Derek's my dad's son from his first relationship. His mom and my dad broke up shortly after he was born, and while they never had much of a relationship, Derek was always closer to my dad than to his mom. Growing up, he spent way more time at our house than his custody arrangement required. I'm pretty sure he was only supposed to be with us half the month, but it felt like he was always around. Maybe my mind's exaggerating because I hated having him there, but it felt like my dad forced us to spend time together, despite our mutual dislike. Derek didn't like me because he saw me as a threat, and I didn't like him because he was a bully. Ever since we were kids, he made it clear he was the favorite, and my dad did nothing to hide it. When my mom passed away after a long battle with lung cancer, everything between me and my dad got even worse. To be honest, things were never great between us. I don't think my dad ever really wanted a kid like me, maybe not even a kid at all. He'd always treated me with this weird, distant coldness, like I was an inconvenience rather than his son. He yelled at me for the smallest things and never showed any affection. No matter how hard I tried to win him over, all I got was silence or anger. But when Derek was around, it was like my dad transformed into the perfect father, everything I wished he would be for me. He was for Derek. He forced us to hang out even though we made it clear we couldn't stand each other. Derek took every chance to push me around, knowing he'd get away with it. When I complained, my dad told me to suck it up because that's how boys were supposed to play. He didn't want me growing up to be a pansy, so I learned to endure it. I never fought back because I didn't want to give my dad more reasons to yell at me. Even when Derek was completely in the wrong, I was always the one who got blamed. My dad never saw anything wrong with Derek picking on me, even though there's a 6-year age gap between us. As Derek got older, the bullying became more subtle. When he hit high school, he switched tactics, using his friends to torment me instead. School used to be my safe place, but once I started middle school, that changed. Derek and his friends would gang up on me, spread nasty rumors, and call me names. I became Derek's idiot little brother, and even my elementary school friends started avoiding me because I wasn't cool enough. By the time Derek graduated and left for college, I could finally breathe a little. Home was still rough with my dad, but without Derek around, it wasn't as unbearable. But then, my mom got sick. The only thing my dad and I had in common was how much we loved her, and her diagnosis shattered our world. Instead of pulling together, my dad distanced himself even more. Where he used to at least talk to me, mostly to criticize me, now, he acted like I didn't exist. I tried to cut him some slack. We were both grieving, and he had his way of dealing with it, but deep down, I wished this could have been the thing that brought us closer. It wasn't. My dad wasn't the kind of person who'd let that happen. With my mom getting worse, my dad's temper grew shorter. He'd either ignore me completely or be so nasty that it nearly broke me. He made me feel worthless, and I just took it because I didn't want to make things worse. When Derek came home from college during this time, something strange happened. He stopped bullying me. He wasn't exactly friendly, but at least he was human. I guess my mom's condition hit him too, and I appreciated that he eased up, even if just a little. Things were bad with her still around, but after she passed, it felt like I was stuck in a nightmare. My dad barely acknowledged me, and when he did, it was only to make me feel even smaller. For a while, after my mom's death, the house was quiet. I did all the chores while my dad stayed in his own world, going through the motions of life like a robot, working, eating, but never really there. I grew increasingly worried about my dad after the funeral and reached out to my grandparents multiple times, convinced he was spiraling into depression, but they brushed me off. It felt like they either didn't care enough to check on their son or, just like my father, didn't want to acknowledge my concerns. After a few months, though, my dad started to regain some semblance of his former self. Unfortunately, that also meant he returned to his old habits of binge drinking and berating me. He constantly ordered me around the house, which was exhausting. I was juggling school while trying to pick up the household chores my mom used to manage, even during her illness. After her passing, all the responsibility fell on my shoulders. My dad and I used to share the workload, but with her gone, I had to shoulder it alone. Whenever I tried to protest, He'd shoot back that since I wasn't bringing in any money, I had no right to complain about my contributions. It felt deeply insulting, but I had no other place to go. I was stuck there, forced to put up with it. For a long time, college was my only hope. The thought of finally escaping my father's control and not having to come back to this house fueled me. Once my mom was gone, this place stopped feeling like home. I could have moved in with my mom's parents after her death, but they lived far away, and with a year of school left, that just wasn't feasible. Then, a couple of months ago, my dad discovered that his golden child, Derek, would be moving back in. Without hesitation, he kicked me out. I ended up moving in with my grandparents, which wasn't the ideal situation but felt like my only option. Derek had left for college a couple of years prior and hadn't returned since. After graduation, he got a job and chose to stay where he was, living with his girlfriend, who wanted to build a life away from home. They got married about 2 years ago, shortly after discovering she was pregnant, which seemed like a well-timed decision for them. Surprisingly, I was invited to the wedding. For that one day, Derek didn't bully me. My mom attended despite her illness. Everyone loved her, even if Derek didn't. His relationship with his own mother was strained. She had never been very involved in his life. By the time Derek got married, she had gone through 4 marriages, seemingly more interested in wealth than in motherhood. It made sense why Derek clung to our dad. He was the only parent who genuinely cared about him, and he clearly didn't want to share that affection with me. After getting married, Derek and his wife welcomed a child and seemed happy for 2 years. Then, 6 months ago, they announced they were moving back in. My dad informed me 2 weeks before their arrival. Smug as ever, he sat me down and told me I needed to find somewhere else to live because Derek was coming home and I had to give up my room. I pointed out that we had 3 bedrooms, asking why they couldn't use the guest room. His response was that Derek and his wife would be staying in the guest room, and my room would become the nursery. My father insisted I leave the house, claiming it was crucial because I was already an adult, or nearly one. Since I'd turn 18 in a few months, I found it both unnecessary and selfish that he expected me to vacate just because he wanted to make room for his family. When I tried to argue with him, it was like talking to a wall. He had made up his mind. I had 2 weeks to clear out, and if I didn't comply, he'd call the cops. I knew there were likely legal avenues I could pursue to contest this, but in that moment, panic consumed me. I didn't trust my father, and I understood he could kick me out without a second thought. I frantically searched for a place to stay and ultimately decided to move in with my grandparents. I had hesitated because they lived far away, and I still had a year of high school left, but with only a few weeks remaining, I felt I had no other choice. Within days, I had moved out, determined not to be there when Derek returned home with his wife and child. My father didn't seem to care at all about my departure. He didn't even say goodbye as I packed up and left with the movers. My grandparents arrived in their truck, ready to confront my father, but I begged them not to. I wanted to avoid any unnecessary drama. Now, 6 months later, I've been living with my grandparents, and I haven't had any contact with my father since he kicked me out. I had no intention of reaching out to him or Derek again. I was about to start college in a few weeks, and I felt no obligation to them after everything that had happened. But then, unexpectedly, they reached out to me because they were in trouble. A few days ago, they showed up at my grandparents' house, and I was taken aback. I hadn't anticipated hearing from them. My grandparents let them in, and I agreed to talk to them. Sensing their desperation, I learned that Derek and his family had returned because he had lost his job and couldn't afford rent anymore. His wife was supportive of this move, wanting to be a stay-at-home mom until their child was older, so returning home seemed like the best option. They thought finding jobs would be easy, but the reality was different. None of the local companies were hiring, and Derek's skill set wasn't unique enough to make him a standout candidate. Somehow, my father managed to get him a job at his company. Neither of them was thrilled about it since it paid less than Derek's previous position, but it was all they had. However, it turned out that Derek had been stealing from the company for the past few months, and this deceit had finally come to light. Now, both he and my father were in serious trouble, as the company suspected they were colluding and threatened legal action if they didn't repay the stolen funds quickly. The only reason they hadn't been sued yet was that the CEO was a close friend of my late mother. Out of respect for her, he hadn't pursued a lawsuit yet, but his patience was wearing thin. Desperate, my father and Derek wanted me to help them. They asked me to claim that they had stolen the money to fund my college education, suggesting that this would soften the CEO's stance and give them more time to repay the money. They reasoned that even if they got fired, at least they wouldn't face prison time. I was shocked they had the audacity to approach me for help after how they had treated me over the years. Without hesitation, I flatly refused. Their plan was absurd, and I wanted no part in it. When I declined, they grew increasingly agitated, insisting that I had to help them because they faced jail time, and I couldn't let some old grudge ruin their lives. I reminded them that it wasn't an old grudge. My father had kicked me out just a few months ago, so it was very much a recent issue. But that wasn't even the main reason I refused to help. I found their plan deeply dishonest, especially since I knew the guy my father worked for. My mother and he were lifelong friends, and he always seemed to like me. I used to call him uncle whenever he visited while my mom was alive. Even at her funeral, we had a meaningful conversation, and I sensed a mutual respect between us. My mother had been the one to encourage him to give my father a job when he was struggling. Instead of showing gratitude, Derek decided to make a fool out of everyone, while my father sought to cover it up and drag me into their mess. It felt incredibly low, and I couldn't, in good conscience, be part of this deception. I told them it would be better for them to face the consequences and repay what they had stolen rather than concoct more lies. They risked jail time if they pursued this foolish plan. They should be grateful for the opportunity to make things right without a lawsuit hanging over their heads, one they would undoubtedly lose, leading to prison time. They didn't realize how simple their situation could be if they chose to come clean. I tried to explain this to them, but my father snapped, saying he wasn't here for a lecture. He wanted me to support their plan instead of offering advice he deemed meaningless. That's when I told him I wouldn't be part of this, and to my shock, he began to cry. I had never seen him like this before, and it made me uncomfortable. He said he had been counting on me because, at the end of the day, I was his son, no matter what happened in the past. He claimed he would have helped me if I were in trouble. He expected the same from me now because this situation was dire, and he didn't want to go to prison. Derek echoed his sentiment, begging for my help, stating that I was well-liked among my mother's friends, making me their only hope. He lamented that my mother would have made things easier, but since she was gone, I was their last chance. It was difficult to turn them down, but I encouraged them again to come clean and repay the money. Their response was hurtful. They accused me of sabotaging them out of resentment for how they treated me as a child. They were disappointed in me and stormed out. I couldn't shake the guilt afterward, imagining them behind bars, but I couldn't be part of something so immoral. Helping them would feel like an insult to my mother, as I'd be misusing her friendship for their benefit. I felt conflicted. Time was running out. My father and Derek didn't have forever to resolve their debts. Was I the jerk for not wanting to cover for my father and half-brother, who had bullied me my whole life? Update 1. I've decided to stick to my guns. Not only is their plan immoral and illegal, but I refuse to be part of it. If my dad and Derek want to avoid jail time, they need to clean up their mess themselves. They have a chance to repay what Derek stole and salvage their reputations, so I shouldn't feel guilty for stepping aside. Most comments echoed my sentiments, advising me to stay out of it, not just because my father and Derek had treated me poorly, but because their actions were reprehensible. I wouldn't be able to carry the weight of their lies like they could. It was clear we were made of different stuff, and I wanted no part in their scheme. If they contact me again, I'll block them. For now, I've already blocked them everywhere, but I know they might try to reach me through different numbers or social media accounts. My grandparents support my decision to stay out of this mess. They believe it's only fair that my father and Derek take responsibility for their actions after how they've treated me. Update 2. Today, my father reached out through text. As I anticipated, it's been 8 days since his last visit, and we hadn't spoken since. He used an unfamiliar number, which I answered absent-mindedly before quickly hanging up when I recognized his voice. Unfortunately, I was a beat too slow to block him, so I received his message. He texted, saying he understood I didn't want to discuss this further, but he and Derek were in huge trouble and desperately needed my help. Their employer was threatening them daily to return the money or face a lawsuit. Guilt washed over me, but I replied that I wouldn't be helping them. They needed to find a way to repay the money instead of running from their problems. I blocked him again, hoping he would understand my stance. Even if he doesn't, I want him to make the right choice. The thought of having a father in prison is unsettling. Update 3. I haven't heard back from my father yet, but my grandparents spoke with my mother's friend, the CEO, to see what his intentions were. We hadn't reached out before, respecting his busy schedule, but we needed clarity, and speaking to my father or Derek was no longer an option. My grandfather had a conversation with him, and he confirmed he would file a lawsuit if the money wasn't returned within a couple of months. He expressed his unwillingness to forgive the debt, but he was still trying to be lenient, given his friendship with my mother. I appreciated that. He was far more understanding than most would be in such a situation. He even apologized to me, expressing regret that this was happening. I reassured him it was no big deal. I didn't live with my father anymore, and frankly, he deserved this outcome. We don't know what will happen next, but I trust my father will figure out a way to repay the money to avoid jail time. It might take a while, but I'm confident they'll sort it out. During our conversation, my mother's friend reminded me that my mother had once mentioned if I ever wanted to intern or find a job, his door would always be open. That's comforting to know, and I'll keep it in mind for the future. Even in her absence, my mom is still looking out for me, which brings me solace.